In this episode,
their pram snapped in two with 2.5-year-old twins in tow. I never knew what that day was going to bring.
Welcome to There's No Place Like Home, Paths to Healing. This series is about domestic abuse, listen with care, produced on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Made in partnership with Commonwealth Bank, who are supporting people within Australia experiencing financial abuse through CommBank Next Chapter, even if you don't bank with them. For many, escaping from an abusive home is just the beginning, because there's surviving the immediate crisis and then there's recovery, everything that comes next.
I never told anybody. I was too ashamed.
We're not having a hardship conversation, we're having a justice conversation.
What's the real price of safety? Escaping an abusive partner is not just difficult, it's expensive. Moving costs, rent, childcare, lawyers, it all adds up, especially if you've already had your money taken or controlled. In this episode, I'm joined by Rachael Lloyd, who moved to a new country for what she thought was love and was instead forced to hand over every cent she earned for years. I'm also joined by the Centre for Women's Economic Security founder Rebecca Glenn and Good Sheppard's Loren Katafono, whose extraordinary work is helping victim survivors process their trauma and rebuild their financial futures. Together, they'll share how this insidious form of abuse follows you after separation and beyond, and the value of freedom for everything that comes next.
Hello everyone and welcome to There's No Place Like Home, Paths to Healing. I'd like to start by asking each of you to share a little bit about yourself and what drives the work that you do, what gets you up in the morning. Rebecca Glenn, I'd love to start with you.
Well, I came at this work, I guess, from a slightly different direction. I don't have a background in domestic violence or social work, but I was working in financial literacy and financial wellbeing when I learned about economic abuse for the first time. And when I learned about economic abuse, I suddenly recognised that the money problems a very good friend of mine was having with her partner were perhaps more than that. And I guess that was really sort of the start of an awakening that was, we have this massive problem in this country with the prevalence of domestic and family violence, the number of women experiencing that kind of control over their finances and economic resources that prevents them from having the kinds of options that every human should have. And I guess, you know, that lit the flame that has stayed alight to this day, and I think we've still got a lot to do.
And that led you to found your organisation. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Centre for Women's Economic Safety was really, how can I do something about this as someone with a background in financial wellbeing, with a background in comms, and so I established the centre really to support women experiencing economic abuse and look at how can we catalyse action, raise awareness of the problem so that women have more economic safety.
Thank you so much. Loren Katafono, you are the New South Wales team lead for Good Sheppard at the Financial Independence Hub. Can you tell me a little bit about the work you do at the moment?
So the Financial Independence Hub supports victim survivors that are focused on their long-term recovery after experiencing financial abuse. So I started as a financial coach in that service, and we also have a team of caseworkers, financial counsellors, therapeutic workers, as well as an interest-free loan. And I guess we are a hub of different service offerings so that we're able to support victim survivors all in the one place to help them figure out the practical but also the emotional resources that they need to feel more financially empowered moving forward.
And you actually worked in crisis before you moved to that long-term healing and recovery. Why did you decide to make that change?
I think I could see with the people that I was working with that financial stability was the barrier for them taking that big next step from separating from the person that was using violence. And I think as a caseworker at the time, I felt like there was limited support I could do to be able to help them feel a bit more confident. And so when I saw the Financial Independence Hub was starting, we could really have those financial focused conversations to be like, okay, so I have an income, I know where I'm living, really helping them have that intense planning so then they can feel more confident as they navigate this next step.
Rachael, I would love to know
how you came to do the work you do as an advocate and as the founder of Lokahi, and a little bit about what drives you in this work.
Well, I was in an abusive relationship for about 8 years, and that was physically, emotionally, and financially abusive, and there was a lot of what we would now recognise as coercive control. And after leaving with 2.5-year-old twins in 2015, I left with nothing. No car, no furniture, no savings, no job, nothing. And really had to reestablish myself and build a new life for myself and my children. And I really wanted very early on to do something to help other victim survivors. I was very fortunate that in the early stages, before I'd even left, when police were involved, I'd been referred to a local domestic violence service. So I had a caseworker supporting me before I'd even left. She helped me when I was finally ready to leave. And she was really the rock for me through that whole process. We had 5 different homes in 7 weeks. Everything that could go wrong did. That
was after you left? You had 5 different, wow. And 2.5-year-old twins.
And 2.5-year-old twins in tow. Everything kept going wrong. And the one thing that was solid for me all the way through, the one consistent, was my caseworker. And so I really wanted to give every victim survivor a caseworker like mine, somebody that could support them for as long as they needed to not just survive that crisis, to resettle and then to rebuild and to help them to become empowered to live free from abuse.
Going back a little bit, because you're not from Australia, you met your perpetrator in 2007 when you came to Australia on a holiday, and then you moved here permanently a few months later to be with him. You came here, you found what you thought was a loving partner and a future. What did that look and feel like in the early days?
I met him. He was working as a concierge at the hotel I stayed in when I was visiting Sydney. He was really romantic. On our first date, I remember him holding my hand around Darling Harbour. He was a true gentleman. It was very intense, very romantic, and I just felt like my heart belonged in Sydney. So it wasn't just him, but he was the reason I was willing to move back so quickly. Now with hindsight, there was only really one red flag in that 3 months, and we used to speak every day, where I had told him about another guy that was still interested in dating me, and he hung up on me and cut me off for a couple of days. And it was only one of my friends calling him from England and speaking to him and reassuring him that I had no interest in anybody else that led him to speak to me again. But I just thought it was because he was so in love. I didn't see that as any means of control or any red flags. And then when I moved here, everything was great for the first couple of months until it wasn't. He was a huge gambler, and I'd never dated anybody that had gambled before.
And did you talk about money in the early days? Because I don't think most of us, when we go into a relationship, we talk about our financial values or what our goals are with money.
Not really. I knew that he had been bankrupt previously, so he couldn't have a car in his name and he wasn't able to get any credit. But he blamed his ex-wife and previous circumstances for that. And I owned a property in England, so I also had a wedding fund that my parents had set up when they divorced. So there was no reason for me to be concerned about his finances, knowing that I was quite financially independent at that stage.
You were the breadwinner throughout the relationship, as you've just alluded to. But you got to a point where you were giving him the money that you earned. Did the people in your life, either here or in England, did they know that was what it looked like for you?
No, I never confided in anybody what was going on financially. So within 18 months of me moving here, he had stopped working and was gambling full-time. I was working full-time And so I just handed over every cent I had every time he asked for it. He gambled away all of our savings. He gambled away my wedding fund. He ended up gambling away the proceeds of the sale of both of the properties that I had. But I never told anybody because I was too ashamed. And by that stage, I was under the impression, I really believed that I needed him, and the only way to survive and maintain that relationship was to hand over every cent I had. I learned not to confide in people because those that I did try and confide in, he would isolate me from.
Yeah, and what did that look like? What were the consequences of pushing back or trying to make that sense of community? Because I think that's often something people don't understand.
The consequences were that I would, get physically assaulted, or that, my phone or my iPad or my laptop would be smashed up. And I was strongly encouraged to defriend those people on Facebook and ensure that, they weren't told about what really went on in our house. But it's done in a very manipulative way. And, the perpetrators don't tell you, take that person off Facebook. And there are some that do. They undermine those relationships. They want to weave their web around you, and to do that means manipulating you so that you believe their version of events, their version of the truth, not what's actually occurred.
Beck, I'd like to ask you, in your work, how often do you hear stories like the experience Rachel's just shared with us?
Daily. The data tells us most people never reach out for support. Many people have been isolated from those friends and family who perhaps could provide that support. And so this is a really, really common experience of women and people around the country.
Yeah, because we just keep blaming ourselves, right? I know that if I had just said something back then, I wouldn't be in this position now. So it's not his fault, it's my fault because I didn't stand up for myself when I should have done. And the deeper you get into it, the harder it is to reassert any control or make the changes to actually get out of it.
Rachael, you and your two sons left nearly a decade later. As you mentioned, they were 2.5 years old. And you said there was a point where you thought to yourself, I'm not sure why I left. This is so hard. Can you explain what was going on in your mind at that point and what made it so hard?
I left with absolutely nothing. All of my family were in the UK. So we had 5 different homes in 7 weeks. Doing that with 2.5-year-old twins in tow is really difficult. And, you're always trying to make sure that they are the priority and they are cared for. Their pram snapped in two when we were going to look for somewhere to rent. My friends hired a car for me so I could go and look at rental places, and that got towed away from outside the motel we were staying in because on the Monday morning it became a no stopping zone. We'd applied for Start Safely through Homes New South Wales, and I had false allegations to them, so they put the application on hold. And through it all, it just felt that I never knew what that day was going to bring, and it was never a positive day. And so I remember saying to my caseworker, well, maybe I should just go back because at least I can manage him when I'm there. And of course, the reality is we don't manage it, because if we could manage it, we'd never be physically assaulted. We'd never be emotionally abused. We'd never be financially abused. We'd never be coercively controlled. But we feel like we have the ability to manage it better when we're there.
Do you remember what the caseworker said to you when you said that?
She said that she was so disappointed that the systems had let us down to such a level that me thinking that it was better to have stayed or to return to him was the better option than having left, and that what I needed to focus on was not what was going on right now, but where I was heading to, why I'd left, and the future that was ahead of me.
That speaks really well to the next question I'd like to ask you, which is about the impact that all of this has on your outlook on life, I suppose, and your ability to exist in any other mode than survival mode, to feel joy or feel happiness or feel boredom even. When you left, you got a Centrelink emergency payment and you spent it on something a little bit unique. Can you please share what you spent that on?
Beck is laughing because she knows this story already. So in the early days of leaving, I applied for a Centrelink emergency payment. To give some context, I had come from the UK without children, where I was financially independent. I worked hard. I could afford to buy nice clothes. And then when I had moved here, I still had nice clothing. I knew that having left, there was no hope of us having financial independence for quite a long time to come. And my children had a roof over their head and they had food over their table. All of their needs were being met. So when I'd paid for what I needed to pay for out of that tiny emergency payment, I went to Sass and Bide and bought myself some new jeans because I knew it was going to be the last pair of Sass and Bide jeans I was going to buy for a very long time.
And for anyone who's not aware, Sass and Bide is a premium designer brand. How did it feel when you bought those jeans?
It felt great. It felt so empowering, as we should feel. You know, I think what we don't talk about enough, and what we at Lokahi we want to remind our clients, is that when you leave, and I had a client recently say it to me, she literally left 2 weeks ago, was that, you know, we feel this huge sense of freedom. So no matter what else is going on, and I think that's what kept me going through those first 6 weeks, was no matter what he threw at us, I didn't have to wake up with him every morning. I didn't have to wonder if he was going to kick one of the bedroom doors open or smash something up. You just feel this huge sense of freedom. And it just felt like, you know, I've done everything I can to keep my children safe. I finally left, and now I'm just going to do one thing that's for me.
Yeah.
I love that, the reclaiming of power. And I think if people have a reaction other than that, and I know people do, I think it's really important we reflect on what that is about, because there's almost this expectation, and it absolutely runs through a lot of community services and it runs through a lot of government funding, is that you should be grateful just to survive on the crumbs that we're prepared to provide. And so sort of to me, that moment of I reclaim my power in this way, that is going to challenge some people. I think it's actually really important that we hold, you know, our own reactions to that and think about it.
You don't have to be grateful for receiving secondhand clothing or secondhand clothes for your children. I partnered with Dandelion Support Network for a long time, and people used to donate baby clothes that had stains on because, you know, the women and children are leaving domestic violence, so it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
What we're actually saying is you are not willing
worthy
to empower somebody that has been through such a terrible experience.
Yeah, it's dignity, right?
Absolutely.
Loren, I'd like to ask you, the Financial Independence Hub at Good Sheppard, when someone comes to you and you are considering how to support them to reclaim financial independence, what are some of the initial questions that you ask them?
What we start with is really that reflective conversation of what financial independence looks like for you. What do you see? What do you feel? What would you be doing differently? Really thinking into the future and that big picture, and trying to unpack that and make that more visual and tangible for them. And then we come back to, I guess, the present moment and thinking about what are some of the steps that you're thinking about taking. You know, trying to get a job, trying to find a car, returning to study, returning to work.
You have described a lot of practical steps, but you also call it financial re-empowerment. Why do you think of it in those terms?
I do believe that there was a point before they experienced the abuse where they did make those money decisions and had that confidence to be able to navigate their goals independently. And so I think we go through this tool called the My Money Story, where we talk about those formative moments of when they first learned about money, how they were taught about money, how they spoke about money, and then walk through it gently with them to think about, okay, well, what do you want this next chapter to look like? Give it a title. And then I guess going back to that visualization piece of feeling like, well, I am the author of this next chapter. I can be that person again. And I feel like with financial coaching, we try to remind people that it's a way of living as well. It's not you being able to tick those lists of goals. It's, do you have agency? Do you have choice? Do you have control? Are you able to have a safe money conversation with the people that you're living with or in a next relationship that you might be considering?
In My Money Story, you've just mentioned that they write their next chapter and they put a title to it and that they're the lead character. And it's practical, but I also hear that a lot of emotional work happening there. It's about being the main character in your own experience. What are some of the titles you see when people write their own next chapter?
Sometimes it's just a word like empowered, confident and free. I can do this.
How do you ensure that when you're doing those 6 sessions with someone that you're setting them up in the long term for that long-term financial independence? What do you find that they need the most and what are the conversations that make those differences?
The financial coaching is focused on that behavior change, that mindset change. Like by having those strength-based conversations, they are kind of rewiring themselves internally as well to look at money from a positive or proactive mindset that's not fear-based.
You've mentioned courage as well, right?
Yeah, courage. So we really are trying to stay non-judgmental, meet them where they're at and recognize that it's such a huge step asking for help. And so mirroring back that they can use those same, their courage, their vulnerability, their
money story.
Yeah, that small spark that made them reach out to us in the first place. Because they can, and when life happens or when post-separation abuse happens, then it can be hard to feel like, it can be hard to stay on track. But I think it's like coming back to, okay, well, maybe you can't take that big step that we talked about last fortnight. What can we pivot and just change the direction a bit to something that's a bit more achievable?
Rebecca, I'd like to ask you about the Centre for Women's Economic Safety's money clinics. Talk to me a little bit about, on the ground, what work happens in those money clinics.
We support women who are considering leaving an abusive partner, often totally unsure whether they're going to be able to afford to live, what that might look like. They're not sure if they can do it. So having those conversations, developing a financial safety plan with them is a really important part of that.
And what is a financial safety plan?
So a financial safety plan is looking at your core pieces for economic independence, such as your identity documents, which are sort of a precursor to being able to access any support payments, open accounts, have a tenancy agreement. Basically anything that you want to do in life, you sort of have to prove who you are first. So ensuring that you've got those important documents. We also support women very often who are in refuges, so they don't have permanent housing right at the moment. Whether or not they have assets in their name is kind of irrelevant at that point. And so we'll look at, actually, do they have debts in their name that they do or don't know about? Work through that kind of thing as well. So it's really very similar principles to the Financial Independence Hub. Meet them where they're at. What is their most pressing concern? That is what we support them with at that time.
Beck, how difficult is it and can it be for someone to leave when they have experienced abuse, noting that there are the personal circumstances, but there are also the systemic supports? So
many systems are actually facilitating the abuse post-separation. So we heard an example there of, you can just call housing and make a random allegation and everything's put on hold while they investigate. A person's, safety is at risk now because she can't afford food, shelter and so on because of that allegation. But we see the same weaponisation of systems with Services Australia and payments, with the tax office, with a whole range of systems that mean the abuse doesn't stop because you've left. In fact, it often escalates. There have been changes in recent years within courts and within systems and within organisations as well in the private sector to try to capture this issue.
Where are those barriers still most prevalent if we're thinking about money?
Yeah, look, there's been an enormous shift, I think, in probably just the last 3 to 5 years. Banks in particular, I think, have stepped up. Is it perfect yet? Absolutely not. But certainly, say, from a money clinic point of view, the difference from when we started the service to now, we have good relationships with the right people in banks who understand we're not having a hardship conversation, which is just can this person afford to pay. We're having a justice conversation, which is this is a debt or this is a situation caused by the deliberate actions of somebody else and it's not just. So I think that's been fantastic, still more work to do. But actually we're now looking at a situation, I think, where governments are really quite behind where the private sector is and they're playing catch up. How do we stop child support from being weaponised? And there is a whole piece of work underway around that. How do we look at tax law to make sure that there is some discretion on the tax office not to further punish victim survivors? So I think governments are squarely in the frame because the impact they have is so big.
Beck mentioned that banks and systems are doing more to support financial recovery. Part of that is funding Good Sheppard. How important is it to ensure that we have the buy-in from community, from government, from organisations?
I think it just shows that it's not just a community and social services issue that is responsible for addressing domestic and family violence and financial abuse. It's workplaces, it's banks, it's, as you said, government institutions and systems, all of us talking to each other, understanding the issues and how they present in these different contexts. The Commonwealth Bank are really involved in understanding the victim survivors that we're working with and understanding even that, like, banking products like theirs and other banks, how those those products can unintentionally perpetrate the abuse. And so then how can they add more processes or protocols so they are ensuring that people are entering, loans or to products consensually and are able to understand those red flags as well.
Beck, we've spoken a lot today about rebuilding financial independence and financial recovery, and you also say there is a misconception that financial literacy prevents financial abuse. Can you tell me why you say that and what you mean?
Yeah, and people mean different things by financial literacy, but economic abuse, financial abuse is not about expertise. It's about control. It's about coercion. It's about taking over. And so I think that the idea that if you just knew about money, it's a kind of a tantalising, if you didn't particularly know about money and then you experience economic abuse, you think maybe if I had known I would have seen it earlier. So I see the attraction in that, correlation. But I think we've got to put the responsibility for abuse and the removal of power onto the person causing the abuse, so that the person using violence.
I couldn't agree more, Beck. I wasn't financially abused because I was financially illiterate. And that's not to say that financial literacy isn't vital and necessary for lots of people who have been impacted by domestic and family abuse. But I was financially abused because I was terrified of the consequences of not handing over every cent. So, for that, I shouldn't feel any shame. I shouldn't feel any blame. I still do, but I shouldn't, because that was solely on him. So I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah, and where I do think that financial literacy is valuable is if we take the broader conception of financial literacy, so not just sort of the mechanics of managing finances, but having money conversations. What are money stories? Let's not hide behind that's not something that we talk about. If we're having money conversations, how do you manage money? This is how I manage money. I'm not comfortable with that. Then those kind of conversations may well flush out. Actually, I don't think that sounds right. That doesn't sound like it's fair. That doesn't sound just. That could be, I think, a really valuable tool in our culture and society more broadly to give people a sort of perhaps an earlier warning than what is kind of the norm now, which is a lot of this just hides under the surface until really things have gone too far.
Loren, what are the conversations you encourage people and women to have in future relationships?
So I think it's understanding that money conversations need to happen with a safe rapport, whether it's a professional or interpersonal relationship. And what does a safe rapport look like then for you? And do you need to rehearse this maybe before you have that conversation? And just normalizing that, like, it's not going to come naturally. It's okay to have a planned conversation of like, hey, I'd like to talk about this with you tomorrow or next week. And then being able to understand what you want communicated in that conversation. Whether you need to have that in a more neutral space like a cafe rather than having it at home, or I think we're encouraging people to maybe plan that and normalizing that it's not going to come naturally.
Do you think that having these conversations more broadly is an opportunity to spot those red flags early on?
Yeah, I definitely do. I don't know that it would have helped in my relationship because the gambling was such a huge part of it. And, people with addiction issues are not generally so open about what's going on for them. But I think if we have those conversations in the same way that we talk about, do you want to have children one day? Do you want to get married one day? I think if we can normalise those conversations, then we're going to have healthier relationships overall.
Rachael, after you left, you eventually started your own charity. Tell me a little bit about it and what you aim to do.
So I set up the Lokahi Foundation so that everybody could have a caseworker like mine, like Rhiannon. And we support women and children in the eastern suburbs of Sydney that have been impacted by domestic and family abuse. And then we will provide very holistic wraparound support for whatever they need. So it can be anything from helping them to find housing to legal support, counselling, food, clothing, you name it. We will help them apply for their leaving violence payment, for victim services. So whatever the clients need. So the main purpose is to re-empower these women to live free from abuse. And we want to support them for as long as they need because most other services are restricted, and not by choice, by financial restriction, budgeting restrictions, to only supporting for 6 to 12 months. But we know that, in 6 to 12 months, you may not even be a quarter of a way through the journey. And that once you have managed to find somewhere safe to live and you've worked out whether you are going to go into some kind of employment or you are already working or you want to study, that's just one part of it. And the counselling and the recovery and the healing is something that takes a long time. And when we have systems that continually let down victim survivors like the family court system, like the criminal court system, where things are drawn out for years, it stops victim survivors from being able to totally move forward with their lives. So we acknowledge that recovery is a journey. I will never say I'm healed. I'm on a healing journey. I'm never going to be the same person I was before. But, we want these women to know that the support doesn't end. And I think our success rate sits at over 97%. So over 97% of the clients that have worked with Lokahi do not return to abusive relationships.
Wow, that's an extraordinary number. You left over a decade ago. How is your financial situation now?
Fortunately, I'm in a position now where, and let me tell you, being the CEO of a not-for-profit is not a great money earner. CEO is a title. When you put it with not-for-profit, it means very little in terms of financial independence. But, I can afford to pay rent. I can afford to make sure my children are comfortable. And, I also want to acknowledge that my mum has financially supported us since the children were born and still continues to do so. So, we're very, very fortunate to be where we are. But certainly, what I went through had a huge impact on my relationship with money and finances and how I view it.
Rachael, you recently marked 10 years since you left and since you escaped. Can you share what you did to mark that?
I changed my name back to my maiden name to celebrate 10 years of freedom. I wanted to do something to recognise that 10 years of freedom, and it was really time to fully reclaim myself.
Congratulations, Rachael Lloyd. That's
Thank you.
incredible. I'd like to finish by asking you a question that I've received, which is, in your opinion, is financial independence and recovery after abuse possible?
Absolutely. It really is. And I think, financial independence means different things to different people. But, if you're not reliant on the perpetrator anymore, then you have made a huge step towards financial independence. I might not own a property in the east suburbs. I might not drive a Porsche, but I'm financially independent. I've financially recovered. I'm no longer bankrupt and, I'm free.
Congratulations. Rachel, Rebecca, Loren, thank you so much for joining me on There's No Place Like Home, Paths to Healing.
Next time on Paths to Healing.
I will never forget a day. That was the 3 stories in front of me. I had to make a choice of who was going to get that room.
This podcast is made in partnership with Commonwealth Bank, who are supporting people within Australia experiencing financial abuse through CommBank Next Chapter, even if you don't bank with them. Contact CommBank's Next Chapter team on 1800 222 387, Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Sydney, Melbourne time, excluding public holidays, or visit commbank.com.au/nextchapter. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and follow or join the movement at futurewomen.com. This episode was hosted by Sally Spicer. Executive producer is Sally Spicer. Our producers are Odessa Blaine and Marcella Rusciano-Barrow, who's also our video producer. Geraldine Bilston is our sensitivity consultant, and our supervising producer is Jamila Rizvi. Audio editing by Dave Collins, artwork by Patty Andrews, videography by Charlie Rogers.